Spiritluvchild, Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody. And hello, Evy Spiritluvchild. She's on the line.
Hi, Victor.
How you doing?
Hello, pretty good. How are you doing?
I am wonderful. Not only because I'm talking to you, but also because, and by the way, whoever's listening, Evie, I've known her for quite a few years now. I think maybe 4 or 5 years, something like that. And when I met her, she's a poet, a writer. She's also an author of different books, poetry books, which I still haven't bought. So note to self. Well, Christmas is coming, so maybe that's my gift, right? Anyhow, so Evie is going to be sharing her thoughts on Harriet, which is the new movie that just came out, and is the story of Harriet Tubman, who I didn't know much about, to be honest, and I told her this before. But, of course, she knows more than I about this topic, so who is more perfect than you to discuss Harriet? And so let's do that.
Okay.
All right, so basically, so for whoever doesn't know the story of Harriet, can you tell us, give us a little synopsis of the history of Harriet Tubman?
Basically, Harriet Tubman was born as a slave, and she is known in history to be a hero for rescuing slaves and helping to free slaves through the Underground Railroad. And she freed over 130, or assisted in helping to free, I think it's over 130 slaves. And she had an old saying. She said, "I would have freed more had they known they were slaves." And that really had a lot to do with the mentality also back in those days.
Right. So yeah, so the movie basically picks up where she's apparently she's dreaming. That's the opening, right? And so, by the way, the actress who plays Harriet is her name is Cynthia Erivo. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but Cynthia Erivo, who plays Harriet, is basically lying on the grass, but she has visions of either, you don't know if it's the flashback or if it's, what is it, right? And I didn't know the story, so I was like, what's this? Turns out that Harriet, her name is not Harriet, it was Minty. Minty had visions back when she was in the plantation. But she basically passes out, and she has this, not flashbacks, but it's like visions of the future. What's going to happen, right?
Vision.
And so, right, yeah. But of course, in those days, that was witchcraft, or that was crazy talk. And so now that we know more about that, we realize she wasn't crazy.
Well, it really depends because of African antiquity, and you got to remember these were Africans that were brought to the States. They were fully aware of those abilities, because in a lot of ancient cultures, especially in African cultures, they had their shamans and their elders. And the shamans were known to be able to communicate between the different worlds. They were known as conduits, and they were known to be able to speak to the spirit world. So to them, whenever Harriet was having these episodes, for them it was her connecting to the spirit world. Now, there was a little bit of difference, because in the movie, the claims were that she gained these abilities after being attacked in trying to defend her sister. I don't know too much about that part of the story. I have read books about Harriet Tubman in the past, and I'd never heard that portion of the story. to say if that in fact existed, because I do know that that can happen. But from my understanding, it was a gift that she's had her whole life as a small child. But it was taken again from African spirituality. So for them, Harriet was more seen as like a shaman and or a medicine woman, because they did have those back in the day. And they knew that when she was having those episodes to leave her alone. Although some people did not understand it, like a lot of the slave masters and things, because they did not come from an ancient spiritualistic system of knowing about shamans and conduits and connecting between realms, different realms and different things as far as that goes.
Right. And the interest, that was one thing about this movie for me, which what it did for me was to illustrate it, right? Which is could have been done by looking at Wikipedia and stuff, but I think the movie really showed me what was she capable of, and also another thing is I'm comparing this to Marvel superhero movies, right? I was talking about this earlier with you, and how we have this Spider-Man movie and Iron Man movies and all this. Now they have the female power, the Captain Marvel and whoever, right? But yet we have a real superhero, female superhero, Harriet, right? Who had abilities like the Marvel heroes, right? And so it's really interesting to me. Like, I'm like, this is a hero. This could have been a Marvel movie, and I'm glad it wasn't, because that would have been a disaster, right? It could have been another Lincoln vampire killer, and so luckily it wasn't. It was a really good movie. I really enjoyed it, much more than The Irishman. For those that are listening, sorry about it, guys. And the spoiler alerts, we're going to tell the spoiler alerts for those that don't know the history, right? That's one thing that you will realize really early on in the movie, is that she had psychic abilities. She can foresee the future. She's she's very connected to her spirit world, and I think what God or with spirit is showing her is what road to take, because she eventually escapes the plantation. Yeah. But she has no knowledge of where to go. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, back in those days, when slaves were trying to get free, they knew to follow the North Star, because the North Star never moves. All the other stars around that star move in the sky, but the North Star never moves. The other thing that the movie depicted, which was true to heart, is the singing. Like a lot of the old, which they're called Negro spirituals, like Wade in the Water, those were actually messages that they would sing to each other, and giving them directions of what to do, when to do it, where to go. Also, they would actually create maps in their hair with their braids. They actually would braid maps in the. I mean, the ingenuity of my ancestors, Harriet Tubman, and all the other ones that we don't know about. Just to watch that movie and to see what she went through does not compare to what actually happened, because, for example, she found her road to freedom with no shoes. So she traveled, I don't remember what the state from, I think it's Mississippi, but from Mississippi to Canada, no shoes, weather conditions, no, the food that she had, I think they depict her having a potato, if that's what she actually had back in those days, because the severity of some of the things that our ancestors suffered, we would not even be able to fathom. So the very fact to watch just a small portion of that in theater, in the movie, was just, for me, awe-inspiring, because the very thing I thought was, wow, and we don't even know the half of it. What we're seeing, because, movies tend to sensationalize scenes for us to, heighten them, like, wow, but we really don't know the depth of what actually happened just fathoming. And if you've ever been to a cotton field alone, standing in a cotton field with no shoes on, I actually did that. I took my shoes off because I wanted to know how it felt.
Oh. Okay.
Yes, I took my shoes off, and it was not pleasant. I'll at least say that much.
Yeah. What was it that was unpleasant? I'm curious to know.
Well, cotton has a hard husk, and the husk is almost can be like needles in your feet if you step on them.
Ah, yes, I agree. Okay.
And the branches, so you're stepping on this, and it's like piercing the bottom of your feet. And so imagine standing in that all day, working, and then imagine her going through all these trails, with no shoes or shoes that don't support her feet like they should. And just the weather conditions. And like I was telling you earlier, I had read up, this was years ago, but even the song Wade in the Water. A lot of times when the slaves tried to escape, there were the bounty hunters and their dogs, so they had to find a place where the dog couldn't catch a scent. So they would actually wade in the water, hold their breath, and put a straw in their mouth and take slow breaths out of the straw. And we're not talking just for a few minutes. Sometimes this was for hours.
Oh wow!
And that would be hard to fathom, breathing through a straw while you're sitting in a river somewhere.
Cold and hypothermia and
whatever's
in the alligators, whatever's going on in those.
Yes, all those conditions.
I couldn't do that. I could not do that.
Yeah.
Well, who could? But she did.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like you say, the movie doesn't really capture all of this, and obviously this requires to have a multi-episode series because the movie doesn't cover much. But what it does cover is the spirit of the seeking of the freedom. By the way, going back to what you said earlier, where she escaped to, by the way, Harriet, or her name was Misty, I think it was her name.
Minty.
She escaped, Minty, sorry, not Misty. I call her Misty because it's mystical what she went through, but she escaped to Philadelphia first.
Yeah, that's right. I apologize. I said Canada. You're right.
But then eventually she went to Canada. And then she basically went back and forth. And so, and she was nicknamed Moses, which was interesting too, because I was like, ooh, Moses liberated his people. Yeah. Huh. It makes perfect sense.
Yes. Not only was she tagged as Moses, but two, it was unfathomable. They couldn't fathom that she was a woman. You got to remember, we're talking about back during misogyny, and to fathom that a woman was going back and forth to free slaves. So they depicted her as a man. They did not believe initially that she was a woman that was doing this. The bounty hunters were looking for a man. And yes, she was dubbed Moses for helping the free slaves.
Yeah, right. That was interesting too. I was like, oh, this is cool. Which I like. I like that the movie was. They didn't treat it as really so much religious, but it was very mystical and very. They kept that magical realism in some parts, I guess, of the movie, and then it was real, but not as real as the other movies that I've seen, like 12 Years a Slave, or other movies that are really, they take away the message somehow. I don't know if you feel like this way. Like, for instance, The Passion of the Christ, or whatever the movie was. That movie, Passion of the Christ, I did not enjoy it because they were too focused on realism, right? And it just went too deep into that. It was so torturous to watch, and so this one wasn't as torturous, but it didn't have the elements where they were being slashed and they had the scars. So.
Yeah. Well, I never saw the movie 12 Years. The Passion of Christ, and that's a whole other discussion. So I won't explain why, but I refuse to see that movie. I've often, from me personally, I've had issues with watching slave movies and the depiction because me being African American and knowing some of the history of my ancestors and knowing what they went through. And oftentimes, even though it's torture and what you see in those movies, it's still sensationalized. You know, our ancestors went through way more than we could even fathom. You know, they used to hang pregnant women from the trees and cut out their babies while the women were alive and let the babies fall to the ground and crush their skulls while the mother is hanging from the tree screaming.
Wow.
You know, so, and there's so much more that happened. The one thing I will say about the Harriet Tubman movement that I did enjoy is that the focus of the movie was on what she did to assist in freeing slaves. So you're right, it wasn't like super religious. We didn't spend a whole bunch of time in the movie of like watching the whole slave scenario, which the other movies do depict, you know,
right.
or making the slaves look like they're not that smart. And like one of the things I had to explain to my own children, because in history, we taught that slaves couldn't read and couldn't write, which I always tell people that is such a, to portray that to society is so dishonest. You know, they came from a different country. They could read and write, but they could read and write in their own languages. Right. That's the same as if we were to go to, for me, if I were to go to Germany right now, I can't read German, I can't write German, but it doesn't mean I'm illiterate. You know, so that's one of the deceptions that I really struggle with in a lot of these slave movies, saying that, you know, the first Africans in America could not read and write, which is so untrue. They were able to write. And that's the whole reason why Africans were brought to America in the first place. They were brought here to create a new world. Because
now, there are some versions, and I have a question for you because, you know, you have more of an understanding, right? But I have heard from some people of African American descent that they believe that the black people were already here. They did not all come from Africa. Okay.
No, and that's.
So I just want to make that distinction.
Yes, both of my grandmothers were Native American Indians, and both of them were black Indians.
Right.
As a matter of fact, there are pyramids in Brazil. There are pyramids all around the equator, not just in Africa but they're all around. There's some in Brazil, yes. But what I will say is that Africans had been commuting with Native Americans prior to Columbus. They actually found, I'm going off key a little bit, but they actually found cocaine and corn in the sarcophaguses in Egypt, in the Valley of the Kings, and some of those tombs in their bodies when they did autopsies. And back during that time, cocaine and corn were only being harvested in the Americas.
Right. So that's the thing. It's interesting, right? Because and then kind of bring it back to Harriet. But to your point is how we don't have much of the history of your ancestors. Mine were European descent, so I already knew mine. But I'm talking about the indigenous people, the Native Americans that were here. We don't have. We either have the history or we burn it down. The Europeans, you know, we wiped them out. We got rid of most of the historical findings that we probably found, and we just destroyed it, burned the books or burned, you know what I mean? So we got rid of it. We got rid of the history, right? We try to wipe them out. Basically, Europeans try to wipe off the history and the existence of any native people.
Yeah. Well, one is guilt.
Yeah.
One reason is guilt, and the other is I've always asked the question: what is the best way for me to control you?
Keep you down. Strip you from any knowledge.
Yeah.
Starve you. Yeah. Right.
It is to take away your identity, because if you don't know who you are, then anything I tell you, you will believe. It's to know more about you than you do. So if I destroy
take away your
history,
God,
I can come, and rewrite your history.
Wow.
And, given a true fact even about my own grandmother, when my grandmother became of age, my grandmother was Creek Indian. And when she became of age, she owned 60 acres of land. Her land actually had oil and water wells on them. She said when she was a little girl, she said the white man who was the banker who had guardianship over her because her mother died when she was 3 days old, her oil wells did something. And she said that they bought 2 houses in an area in her name where they knew she could not live. When she became of age, 18, she was married with children. They set her house on fire. She woke up, and they had to jump out the window to save their lives. She just happened to wake up. Her uncle who raised her, who was her father, made her sign over her land to the banker. She calls him the white man because the banker had custodianship over her to save her life, because back in those days when the children were becoming of age to take ownership of their land, they were finding them dead and they were killing them and burning down their houses. And my uncle was afraid for my grandmother's life, so he made her sign over her land to the banker to save her life.
Wow. Wow.
I spoke to the governor of Oklahoma years ago. I did not know that my grandmother had a tag number, just like the Jewish did in the concentration camps. The Native Americans have numbers. And he gave me my grandmother's name, told me what her number was, and told me that there was nothing that we could do because the statutes of limitation had already expired.
Wow.
So I guess I say this because going back to Harriet, I can relate personally to this story, personally to the struggles, personally to a woman of power and being so strong and being fearless. What amazed me is her ability to be fearless and believe in her gift. She believed in her gift, even though she didn't have proof of where she was going. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know the journey, but she knew the destination.
Yeah.
She didn't know how she was going to get there, but she knew she was going to get there.
Well, she had a mission. So her first mission, for those who haven't seen the movie, so basically she escapes by herself, obviously, first, right? And then she doesn't find herself in this free society, right, in Philadelphia, I think. So, anyways, she could have stayed in Philadelphia, you know, and that would have been the end of the movie. And so when she goes back, and they're like, "Why are you gonna go back? You just went through all that, and you cannot go back. You're not gonna make it, right?" So one of the actors, I forget his name, he's also black. He tells us like, "No, you're not doing that. I forbid you from doing that, right?" Yeah. It's just like, you do not. I like what she said, or whatever she said. It's like you don't tell me, you don't forbid. You know what I mean? Like, don't do that because I'm not doing it. And she does it, and so she goes back to get her husband, right?
She actually was going back to not just her husband, but her family. She was going back to get her husband and some of her brothers and her sisters.
Right.
And you're right. She was a very outspoken woman, which, you know, in those days that was, I won't say rare because it did happen, but because of the societal views and ideologies back in those days. And that's why he forbade her, because women didn't do things like that. It was the men.
Yeah.
The women were the
Right.
ones that were at home helping to hide them, and they weren't on the forefront. She was actually on the forefront, and we don't hear a lot
Right.
about the women being on the forefront.
Right. Yeah. And so that was another aspect of the story too, right? So there's the women, the preaching on the women, which went on for another 100 years and still going on.
Yeah.
There's so many things against her, right? There were so many things that were against her, but she just trusted her instincts. And anyway, so she went back and forth, but she went back and then realized her husband was already remarried, which was another, another realization. It's like, why am I here? God told me to come here, and you're married, remarried.
Yeah.
And I don't blame him, obviously. I mean, she could have been dead. But the point was that she got this message to go back. And she was trying to figure it out. It's like, what are you trying to tell me? Like, what is my message? Like, I don't understand. So it was really cool, like, how she didn't know. It's like, you don't know what your mission is until you're in the middle of it, and you're like, I'm supposed to rescue everybody else.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
Well, another thing we kind of didn't discuss, and I will discuss a little bit on her husband. What had happened? Her husband and her father were free. Okay, this was after the Emancipation Proclamation. What a lot of people don't know is prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, there were blacks there were African Americans who were free, but a majority of those were men, because back in the day, what would happen is that the women were considered their most valuable property because of her ability to give birth. So what they did, they would free the men, but keep the women as slaves.
Keep the women.
And what happened is the men would be allowed to come back and have conjugal visits with their wives because they wanted the wives to get pregnant. But when the women got pregnant, what happened is the slave master would say no, and that's why the bloodline back in that day was traced by the mother and not the father. Because if the mother was still a slave, then the child was a slave regardless if the father was free. Because if you remember, the movie starts, like we said before, she was in the grass having an episode, a psychic episode, when her husband came up to talk to her. And what happened, he had went to court, and he had gotten her freedom papers. So he went to go talk to the slave master to say, I want to pay for my wife's freedom. The court says I can do this.
Right.
And remember, the slave master ripped up the paperwork. And initially, that is why Harriet was escaping in the first place. She was supposed to be escaping to meet her husband. He wanted them to go together, and she was like, no, I'm going to do this on my own. I will meet you there. But he never showed up. So she figured he got caught up when she did.
Right.
And so she went back sometime later because she had visions about him, and he was already remarried with, with his new wife, with another woman, another baby, with a baby on the way. Because that's the whole reason that they were trying to escape in the first place, is because they were trying to have children and they wanted their children to be free. Now, this is all the depiction of the movie. I don't know how true that story is. I'd never read or heard that story before. But I do know this, that she could not read, and I do know they didn't depict it in the movie, but she, in an article I read a long time ago, she said that she was on the porch, and lightning had struck her. She was praying to God, lightning had struck her, and when she came to, that she was able to read. She had the Bible in her lap, and she could read the words, and it was instant. And she often told that story during her speeches, that's how she learned to read. No one taught her. That lightning struck her. And when she came to, she was able to read.
Wow. Yeah. Why not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you tell your story, you tell your truth, and who are we to question it, right? Yeah, anything's possible. I don't disprove. I don't doubt it. But she got the gift. So she got the gift of reading and understanding, and interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another
And I
character
don't
I wanted to
remember
talk about. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
just really quick, I wanted to say for people that want to do the research, I do not remember the book I read that from. I was actually very young. I was in high school when I read this story. But I will say Google, right now you can Google just about anything. So I would suggest that you do some Google, research the story of Harriet Tubman and when she learned to read. I'm pretty sure you'd be able to find the book if you Google just Harriet Tubman and the story of how she learned to read, because she spoke about it a lot in her speeches. So I apologize for that. I just wanted to say.
No, thank you. Her speeches are audio speeches, or they're just like reading down? Because back in the days,
what happened is after she became an abolitionist, she then became a motivational speaker, and she spoke all over.
Yeah.
And she would tell her story. And so one of the stories that I do know that she used to speak about is how it came about her learning how to read. And she said in the story that a lot of times people did not believe her.
Yeah. So she wrote these speeches down, or somebody maybe wrote it, at the time.
I think somebody else wrote them for her. Yes.
Okay. Which makes sense. Because this is basically we're going back to the 1850s. So obviously there were no recording devices.
These were interviews she had.
Okay. Because she died in 1913. That's what it says here. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it could have been her own interviews, which would be. I'll look it up on YouTube and see if there's any, but I'm sure there's a lot of stuff about her because I'm really interested in her, in listening at least her speeches. It would be interesting to see to hear it. Anyway, there's another character before we go because we have 10 minutes, but
okay.
There's this actor called Omar Dorsey. Now, Omar Dorsey, he plays one of the characters in the movie, Bigger Long. I don't know if that's a real name, but he's basically a freed slave, right? And he gets together with the Gideon Broders character, who is basically the son of the plantation owner, right? So the plantation owner dies, and he becomes the new owner of the plantation. So, but Bigger Long, who is black, and him, who is white, they team together to basically they want to hunt down. At the time, they didn't know it was her. They thought it was Moses. So more than the white character, I was even more mad about the Bigger Long character, who is black. And so why do you think? Where do you think his hate came from for Harriet? That's my question, I guess. What was the motivation for him? Like,
give me a second because I am contemplating on how to answer this question. In every
I know it's a loaded question.
Yeah, we have our own that will sell us out. There is no ethnic group that is that doesn't exist. It exists in all groups. Actually, slavery itself was a position of us being sold out from some of our own when we got here. Because the initial Africans in America were not slaves. The very first Africans and Americans were not slaves. I can't remember his first name. His last name was Johnson. But I did want to clarify that. And somewhere it kind of took a toll and went in another direction. But the first Africans and Americans were not slaves. But his role, to this day, you will find people that are about greed. and his role was about money. Now, I don't know how true it was that he was African. He was a bounty hunter. That he was African American.
Yeah.
I do know he was depicted as African American in the movie. Also, there was another young African American boy with him who actually ended up becoming a ally to Harriet towards the end of the movie, because he saw her gift. He actually was watching her and saw her gift. Don't know how true those two characters are. I never read about them before, but that's not to say just because I didn't read they didn't exist. They very well might have. But to say that
anyway, the character's name was Walter, by the way, the one that you're mentioning right now.
The other guy, Walter, right. But needless to say is that we all have our own that sell us out. We have our own family members that sell us out. So it's not unfathomable that would happen, but it is hard to digest to watch in a movie, especially when you see how African Americans and Africans were being treated during slavery.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what he was trying to do is gain. Greed is one thing, but also some sort of social status, and I think that's what he was actually.
He was in the South. He was a black man in the South, so there wasn't a lot of social status for him to get. He was already known as one, according to the movie, as one of the best bounty hunters that existed. That's about as high of a status he could have gotten back during that time as a black man during slavery in the South. So it wasn't so much about his title as it was about greed. That's what I saw. But again, and the reason I want to emphasize, about the greed and that it happens in all of our cultures and even in our families, how sometimes we'll be sold out, is because that was a really big issue in the black community of people not wanting to go see the movie because, like, again, they're pitting us against each other. But the truth is the truth, and it doesn't, it doesn't matter about it being what does matter. But I just want to say that happens in all cultures, and it even happens in families. A lot of times, greed and materialism will get in the way of love and truth.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's like telling the story of Jesus Christ and not mentioning Judas.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. I mean, how can that be told? It's not. You cannot do that. Like that was a pivotal role that Judas played, the betrayer, the traitor, right?
Exactly.
Otherwise, there would be no history, no story. Yeah. You have to have an antagonist to the story.
Right, and that was my point. He was an antagonist that was used, but it's not just because there was one person or two. We get so caught up sometimes, people, and like, oh, they're depicting this, but things like that really did happen. But it didn't just happen with African and African Americans. Also happened with the Europeans. A perfect example that's not discussed, and I wish more movies would show it truthfully. There were not just black slaves. There were Asian slaves. There were Native American slaves. There were European slaves. Back in the day in Europe, when the impoverished Europeans, say they stole an apple, they went to court, they had a choice: either see the guillotine, get your head chopped off, or go in the Americas and work as a slave. There were white slaves too. We don't talk about that.
Did not know that. I'm telling you. Wow, I did not know that.
The word slave itself is a European word. And it's original. It's known not slave but Slav, and it is associated with peoples that have from the Slavic. It's a Slavic language from Slavic countries such as Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. The word slave itself is a European word, and it originated in Europe.
Wow. See, why didn't I have Evy before in my show? Oh God! But you know what? It was a great discussion. I'm not doing a part two of this one because you know what? I've been telling everybody I'm gonna do a part two. I'm gonna do a part two. I am not doing a part two on Harriet. The movie was great, phenomenal.
Yes.
Movie of the year, maybe. Better than Irishman, yes, for sure. Robert De Niro, no, doesn't deserve the Oscar. Give it to Cynthia Erivo. She did a great job portraying Harriet, who actually, I think she's British too, if I'm not mistaken.
I know it's time to go, but just to say there was some controversy even with
Yeah.
Evero, and it because of some derogatory things she had said about African Americans being a black British actress. You know, there was a lot of controversy about that, but she did play the role very well. You know, I saw it, and I did enjoy the movie. It was a really, really good movie. It was a very awe-inspiring movie.
Right. So, yeah, that's actually, that will be it for today because we have like a couple minutes left. But once again, I want to thank Evy. She's phenomenal. I want to have you again in any other topics that you want to talk about. And also, I'll be putting some links below because she's got books, guys. She's got great poetry. But I'll let that will be another show.
Okay, perfect. And thank you so much for having me, Victor. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And here we go again. Guys, I'm going to wrap it up. And you didn't see this coming, did you?
We are go for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Hit the record
Gosh, that's swell. Well, I didn't see that coming.